Reading from all those brothers and sisters there who are kind of sharing the same faith as people here. So it's wonderful to be part of that family of God, as we've been reminded, I think, already this morning. And wonderful to be here. First time I've been to this church, heard lots about you from Nathan over the years, so it's wonderful to be here. Rowan mentioned the book of Deuteronomy earlier on, and right at the end of that book, as the Israelites are poised to enter into the promised land for the first time, about to go in and set up home and grow crops and rear animals, Moses says when you get in there and you do those things, you must bring some of all of that produce and bring it before the Lord your God. And then in kind of a strange kind of Father's Day sort of thing, he says in that day, as you bring those things to God, you're to remember your forefathers, your ancestors. And in fact, here are the words that you must all say together on that day. You're to say, my father was a wandering Aramean. He went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us, made us suffer. But the Lord heard our voice, and he saw our misery and our toil and our oppression, and he brought us to this place to give us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so now I bring the first fruits of that soil to you, Lord, because you have given it to me. Promises that God made, now fulfilled and being enjoyed. But the Israelites must not forget their past as wandering people. Which is really striking, because migrants often don't want to remember. Because remembering stirs up lots of things. For some, it stirs up a yearning for the place that we once called home. Makes us think of sights and sounds and smells that we miss. Or creates an ache in our heart for faces we can no longer see. For others, that kind of remembrance just stirs up all the painful memories and the reasons why we had to leave home in the first place. Remembering kind of the process of setting up life in a new place is kind of fraught with difficulty as well. You're a stranger in a foreign land, everything's difficult, everything's new. Every time you open your mouth and speak, your accent gives you away and you come across as a foreigner who doesn't belong, with no roots in this place, no extended family to fall back on. Why would you want to remember all of those things, all of those difficult things? And yet remembering the difficulties of being wandering people is exactly what the author of Genesis 26 wants us to do. This story he tells is a migrant story about Isaac, the son of a migrant and a nomad himself, as he wanders, as he journeys from Beer Lahai Roi to Gerar and on to Beersheba. Where is home? Where is stability? Where is permanence? Not here. But it's not just Israel's forefathers who know what it is to be a migrant. Some of you, like Joe and I, have wandered here from Europe. Others of you have come from Africa, Polynesia, from Asia. In fact, more than half the people in New Zealand were born somewhere else and have moved here. And yet, even if that's not you, even if you're determined never to leave the suburb that your grandparents grew up in, the Apostle Peter reminds us, doesn't he, that we're all aliens and strangers. Foreigners in our own land, foreigners in our own culture because we belong to Jesus. Where is home? Where is stability? Where is permanence? Not here. Genesis 26 has something, I think, to say to each one of us this morning. Because this is also a story about the God who is a firm place on which we can stand. The God who is consistent. And the God who guarantees his people's blessing. And Act 1 in this story begins by remembering a famine. Not the same one that had inspired Abraham to flee to Egypt, but yet another food shortage. Just one more reminder of those ominous words spoken by God in the garden, telling that rebellious human pair that from now on their lives would forevermore be marked by pain. Not so much the physical pain of birth or of blistered hands after a day in the fields, but rather anguish, trepidation, inner turmoil connected to children and to food, an anguish felt by Isaac's wife Rebekah as she failed to conceive for 20 long years, just like her mother-in-law before her, and now the fearful prospect of not having any food again. And the next phrase in verse 1, I think, speaks volumes as we read that Isaac went to Abimelech, the Philistine chieftain in Gerar. Isaac and his family had been living down south in Beer Lahai Roi for quite some time. Why did he go to Abimelech? Why make that journey north? Well, it's the unexpected crisis of a famine. Just exposes in an instant the fragile nature of migrant life, in which kind of independence can become dependence in the blink of an eye. And maybe Isaac was hoping here that the friendship that had existed between Abraham, his father, and Abimelech would help in this moment of crisis. Or maybe that there might be more food on the coastal fringe. Verse 2 even implies that this was just a pit stop on the way to Egypt. But whatever Isaac's motives were, there in Gerar the Lord appeared and spoke to him. And the Lord said to him, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands. And through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commandments, and my decrees." Now, if you're familiar with the book of Genesis, that language ought to kind of ring bells. We've heard this sort of thing before, haven't we? Familiar promises from the book of Genesis now being re-spoken to Abraham's son. Promises about place and progeny and presence. And then climactically in verse 4, a declaration that through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. In desperate days, the Lord speaks a word of comfort and encouragement and assurance. His plans are not in jeopardy. And in fact, as Heather read the passage for us, you may have noticed, connections to Abraham are all over the place here. He's mentioned by name 8 times in chapter 26. All those promises made to him in days past are now being repeated and said to Isaac, word for word. Even the whole story is familiar or similar to episodes in Abraham's life. The setting of a famine and kind of the plan to go to Egypt. Another deception involving saying that my wife is actually my sister and not my wife at all. Abimelech and Phicol as characters, we've seen them before. What's the point of making all of these parallels between Abraham and Isaac? Well, I think the narrator's showing us that the Lord relates to Isaac just like he'd related to Abraham. The human characters in this story may come and go, but the Lord remains. And the Lord remains consistent. Always there, always watching what happens. And now this God who is always there says to Isaac, inviting, I think, a response of obedience and trust, he says, stay. Stay in the land where I tell you to live. Famine or no famine. The Lord declares his intention to bless Isaac in this place. And so verse 6, Isaac, the alien, the foreign resident, stayed in Gerar. But new circumstances create more unforeseen difficulties for this family of outsiders. Some of the local men notice Rebekah. And Isaac, maybe like us if we're prepared to admit it, begins to think and act much like his parents would have done. In verse 7, when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, "She's my sister," because he was afraid to say, "She's my wife." He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, because she's beautiful. Motivated by fear, motivated by a need to preserve his own life, Isaac acts. But the ruse only lasts for so long. Sometime later, Abimelech looked out from his window to see Isaac and Rebekah caressing. Now, the verb literally means to laugh. And remember that Isaac's name, Yitzhak, means laughter. So Abimelech looks out of his window and sees laughing with Rebekah. You think, how typical. Now, it's hard to know exactly what they were doing, but whatever it was enough for Abimelech to make the connection that she's not your sister, she's your wife. Why did you tell us that she was your sister? And Isaac's attempt to kind of justify himself in verse 9 fails, because Abimelech responds again in verse 10. He says, "What is this you have done to us?" The exact same words that Abimelech had to say to Abraham a generation before, when he tried to pass Sarah off as his wife. And that memory of divine judgment seems to linger in Abimelech's mind. Look at verse 10 where he says, "One of the men may well have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." Now bear in mind that in the ancient world, adultery was considered the great sin, subject to divine judgment, whether it was intentional or unintentional. You think, so much for Isaac bringing blessing to the nations. Instead, driven by his own fear, he ends up endangering Abimelech, and Abimelech knows it. And so the chief forbids touching either Isaac or Rebekah, as much for the protection of his own people as for theirs. And this kind of sense of growing antagonism develops as the story continues. In verse 12, Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold, because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich. Literally, the man became great, just like God had promised to Abraham. But he became rich, he became great, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. But the life of a migrant is often one step forward and two steps back. Success generates its own problems. Because just like they had noticed his wife, now the Philistines notice his wealth. And so in verse 14, he had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. And so all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. And then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us. You've become too powerful for us." Now, I think one could say on reading this story that of the digging of wells, there's no end. There's lots of digging going on all the way through this story. And that continues to be the case as Isaac and his family move once again. In verse 17, he moved away from there, encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died. And he gave them the names that his father had given them. And yet once more trouble follows. Isaac's servants dug in the valley, discovered a well of fresh water. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen and said, "That water's ours." And so he named the well Esek, which means quarrel, because they disputed with him. And then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one as well. And so he named it Sitnah, which means hostility. Great promises from God that God would be with him in this place. Even a direct word to stay in this land. And yet a lived experience that proves so unpredictable. Who knows what's going to happen next? Constantly impacted by opposition and now even injustice. I mean, these were family wells that his own father had dug. And yet, verse 22, he moved on from there again, dug another well again, and no one quarreled over this one. And so he named it Rehoboth, saying, now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in this land. That's Act 1 of the story. In Act 2, it opens by shifting location. Verse 23, Isaac moves to Beersheba. And there in Beersheba, the Lord again appears and speaks to Isaac. And he says to him this time, he says, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. Yet another reiteration of familiar promises, but now with something new that wasn't said before. Do not be afraid. Isaac had demonstrated in Gerar that God's people can be in the very place that he wants them to be, and yet still be driven by fear and self-preservation. And because of that, God says, do not be afraid. And so, verse 25, Isaac built an altar there, called on the name of the Lord. He pitched his tent there, and his servants dug a well. Just like Abraham had built an altar and called on the name of the Lord in the same place. And then, just like in Act 1, after the Lord speaks and after Isaac acts, Abimelech reacts to what's going on. Verse 26, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahuzat, his personal advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his forces. And Isaac asked them, why have you come to me, since you were hostile and sent me away? And they answered, well, we saw clearly that the Lord was with you. And so he said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. So let's make a treaty with you so that you will do us no harm, just as we did not molest you, but always treated you well and sent you away in peace. And now you are blessed by the Lord. And so Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. And early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. And then Isaac sent them on their way, and they left him in peace. Do you notice all the subtle reversals from what happened earlier in the story? In verse 1, Isaac had literally walked to Abimelech. Now Abimelech walks to Isaac. Abimelech had been the one in the position of power, summoning and questioning Isaac, but now Isaac questions him. Isaac had been afraid of being hurt by Abimelech in verse 9, but now Abimelech wants to make a treaty so that Isaac won't harm him. Isaac had gone to Abimelech in a time of famine, needing food, but now he prepares a feast for Abimelech. Abimelech had sent Isaac away, now Isaac sends Abimelech away. The tables have turned completely. Everything's turned around. Famine and quarrel and hostility have been replaced by feast and treaty and peace. And that reversal of fortune is forever remembered in the name given to this place. And once again, surprise, surprise, it's all about digging wells. They dig another well. This one they call Shiva, which means oath. And so the name of that place forevermore becomes Beersheba, the well of the oath. In this story, I think the narrator wants us to see a number of things. I think the first relates to the hero of the story. This is a rags to riches tale, isn't it? Kind of inauspicious beginnings, yet a glorious end. But in rags to riches stories in books and in movies, the spotlight usually falls on the protagonist, doesn't it? I mean, all the things that happen just slowly expose their inner worthiness, which accounts for the success they have at the end of the story. That's how they go, isn't it? So think of Aladdin, think of Jane Eyre, think of the Ugly Duckling or Cinderella. That's the way all those stories work, isn't it? The person revealed to be worthy of kind of the glory they get at the end. Hidden at the start, revealed for all to see. But Isaac's story is quite different. Yes, there's the same journey, there's the same radical reversal, rags to riches, from famine to plenty, from opposition to peace, from subservience to dominance. But Isaac is not the cause of that. The Lord is. We've already been primed as readers to hear that point and not to miss the point. Back in 25:11, where we read that after Abraham's death, God blessed Isaac. And that theme of God blessing is repeated all the way through chapter 26. Again and again, God says things like, I will bless you, I will give, I will make. And he does. Isaac reaped 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. He found room to flourish because the Lord gave it to him. Abimelech says, we clearly saw that the Lord was with you, that Isaac had been blessed by the Lord. And so as readers, we must understand that it is God who brings blessing. Whether for this single family wandering their way through the deserts of southern Canaan, or for the whole nation of Israel that would one day come to inherit this place, God is the one who does it. I think to miss that point, to believe that you are the one responsible for bringing blessing into your own life, is actually the impetus that leads to idolatry. From the Garden of Eden to the Tower of Babel to the suburbs of South Auckland, FOMO is just a new label for an old trait. The fear of missing out. Fear of missing out on the things that we desire. That's a really powerful motivator. And if God appears stingy, or if God appears slow to act, then the temptation is to grasp and to seize what we can when we can. And in fact, the chapters that come before and after chapter 26 are all about grasping and seizing, as Jacob manipulates and deceives in order to get what he can from his brother. But the author of Genesis has deliberately placed chapter 26 here to say something different. And I say deliberately placed because the arrangement is not chronological. It doesn't move in the expected order. You might have wondered as the story was read and as we looked at it, you kind of think, where are Jacob and Esau gone? Like they were there before, now they disappear and then they come back. I think verses 7 to 9 confirm that this episode actually belongs before chapter 25. Because the Philistines would not have mistaken Rebekah as an unmarried woman if she had two twin boys running around the place. But what's gained by placing chapter 26 here and not in order? Well, I think sandwiched between two stories that are all about human grasping after blessing, chapter 26 becomes a really powerful counterexample. The key point is this: the Lord is the one who brings blessing. It will not be achieved by human grasping. And yet this story also invites us to contemplate the gap between promise and experience. In verses 2 to 5, and again in verse 24, God restates his intention to bless Isaac and his family, to give them these lands, to make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and through him to bring blessing to all nations. But that's all rather vague, isn't it? A bit lacking in detail. Especially considering the present crisis. Like, what exactly are we going to eat tomorrow? It's a famine. What are we going to eat next week? Do we plant crops or do we not? Do we stay here in this place or move again to the next town? And when exactly will God give us these lands, and by what process? How many children can we expect? How many grandchildren? What will their lives be like? Will they have to wander around as migrants as well? So many questions and so few answers. There's an uncertain certainty at play in Genesis 26. On the one hand, absolute certainty that God will do exactly what he says. And yet on the other hand, no certainty at all about what each day might hold. Will famine strike again? Next month? Next summer? Maybe. Will there be more strained relationships, tricky interpersonal conflicts to negotiate? Possibly. Will unforeseen situations arise to cause us to worry and to fear? Probably. Sure and certain promises, but so much left unsaid, so much left unspecified. A destination, but no roadmap. And this is the place that God invites his wandering people to inhabit. And in that way, Genesis 26 becomes a call to trust and to believe and to press on, even when you don't have all the details, even when everything is not assured beforehand. Convinced, though, that God will do it. Somehow. Sometime. But is that all we have? Kind of an uncertain certainty, just left to muddle through as best we can and hope that everything turns out. Well, I think there's one more theme in Genesis 26 that's important to add to the picture. And that's the assurance of God's presence. In each place that Isaac traveled to, Gerar and Beersheba, the Lord appeared to him. And the language is that of a theophany, a physical manifestation of the Lord perhaps, just like he had appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre. Or maybe it's an appearance in a dream. The narrator doesn't really tell us which it was. But either way, the Lord appears and the Lord speaks. And he says the same thing. Each time he says, I am with you. It's the first time in Genesis that God says such a thing. He says it twice. I am with you. And so regarding that uncertain certainty that his people will experience, God promises, I am with you. It's no surprise at all, is it, when Jesus sends out his disciples into the world at the end of Matthew's gospel with a big picture commission to make disciples of all nations. But without supplying any of the details, the very last words he says are these. He says, surely I am with you all the days until the end of the age. The end of the age will come. God will bring to completion all that he's promised. But into that gap between promise and experience, for all the days between this day and that day, Jesus says to his people, I am with you. My father was a wandering Aramean, just a migrant in a migrant's tale, looking for home, looking for stability, looking for permanence. Where can those things be found? Not here. And yet, as we journey onwards like Isaac, in uncertain certainty, let's remember Genesis 26. For this is a story about the God who is a firm place on which to stand, the God who is consistent, the God who guarantees his people's blessing, and who promises, I am with you. Let's pray. Father, thank you for these words written so long ago and yet continuing to speak to us as your wandering people. Help us in all the uncertain certainty in which we live, with all that presses upon us even this morning, to remember you, to remember your great faithfulness, all through every generation, and to remember those words that Jesus left his disciples with: I am with you all the days